2020, we can observe also drastic changes in air quality, particularly in Italy. This was also well documented, and in Italy, they also had a link between the number of COVID cases in regions with more air pollution, where there was more pollution. And these maps of China from January 2019 versus January and February 2020 indicate a key reduction looking at the pollutants, the air pollutants in the major regions in China.
Thus, it had a major impact on the environment. A last important aspect for us to discuss is the role played by the Amazon in the current pandemic and the next ones. Karen will tackle this, but let me say that the Amazon contains thousands of viruses that are today in balance with the fauna and the flora, and these viruses are unknown to science. If we continue to the deforestation in 10 or 20 years, it's a matter of time, we will have similar pandemics or even worse than the COVID pandemic. This is true about the Amazon, but also for African Southeastern Asian forests. So many of these viruses are in rainforests, and so designing programs to avoid forest destruction is crucial to avoid new episodes like this one. And to conclude, let me stress a very controversial issue. This is from the BBC. The coronavirus recovery plan must tackle climate change. This is an ongoing debate in the academia. Let me tell you what I think. Basically, COVID-19 did not change anything in terms of climate change. We have the same economic system, the same companies, the same very short time vision by governments and companies, and in 2019, we have the same governments as in 2022. The decrease of 7% in emissions, well, we had, it will go back to the previous level, and the GHG emissions will continue to increase. COVID-19 is having and will have an important impact on society. The economic impacts and the impacts of climate change can be even more important than the COVID-19 impact. But these are aspects we should discuss later on. Let me thank you for your time, and I'll give the floor back to Vera Paiva. Thank you, Paulo. As usual, you've been concise and very straightforward. Your conclusion was exactly our topic here. It concerned socioeconomic and political aspects that are having an impact on the current situation. Now I give the floor to Professor Karen Gonçalves. She is an epidemiologist and a professor at Escuela Andaluza, Public Health Escuela Andaluza in the Granada University, and she's a researcher at Fiocruz. And then we'll hear from Professor Maria Purificación Nera, who is a professor of health at the Public Health School at the WHO. Karen, good afternoon. This is our Spanish summer. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here with you, Paulo, Maria. Paulo, um, uh, my presentation coincides in part with yours. I will follow up on a few aspects Paulo mentioned about the pandemic and the environmental issue. I will present my point of view, the epidemiological point of view. Let me share my presentation with just a few slides to help follow my reasoning. Would you agree we give the floor to Professor Maria and then you take the floor later on? Yes, yes. The connection's not helping. And so let's do that. Okay. Let's give the floor to Dr. Maria, and then you send the presentation by email. And this is how it goes when we go live. We have to face this kind of situation sometimes. Dr. Maria, good morning. Let me introduce Dr. Maria Purificación Eira. He is the director of the Public Health and Environment Department of the WHO. She was the president of Food Safety Agency in Spain. She was the director of the Department of Eradication of the WHO in Geneva, and she is in charge of the Cholera Control Department. Thank you for accepting our invitation, Dr. Maria. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I apologize for my Portuguese case. You have to be very understanding about it. I don't know if it's enough for more than social chit chat, but let me try. I'm sorry if I use a word in Spanish or in English. So, Karen, we are all learning. We use this remote work every day as best we can. So do not worry. Even Bill Gates has this problem. So do not worry. We've all been through it. So relax. Como não podia ser de outra maneira, não é? A apresentação do professor Paulo. Professor Paulo Artacho's presentation was very interesting. This was a great introduction. What's the problem? What are the issues we are facing? I do not agree on one thing. He says the science is the key. Yes, I agree, but we need something else to overcome this current crisis. Intelligence, Paulo. I think that if, well, science will provide solutions, but we will need a lot of common sense as well, and a pinch of intelligence so that we will be able to use this information science will provide us. And I hope humankind will be able to do that, to use intelligence and common sense to understand that if we do not overcome those problems concerning production, recycling, etc., our interaction with our ecosystems, with our biodiversity, well, we have to understand that if this message is not widespread, we will be facing further difficulties. Dr. Artacho allows me to start from to pick up from where he left. we we will face those issues more often from now on. Our world might be prepared to extinguish fires, these fires, but we have to tackle the causes um, of these fires. Destruction of the ecosystem, deforestation. If we do not solve this aggressive relationship we have with the source of our health, which is the environment, we will be destroying these ecosystems on which we are dependent. We rely on them to breathe, to eat, to have water. We are polluting, contaminating the air, the water, and the food we produce. This is an utter lack of common sense. This is self destructive. It's something we have to correct. And to change that, we have to rely on society. After COVID 19, well, I agree, COVID 19 will not speed up the struggle against climate change. I agree that our population is really concerned, really traumatized, but they are not prepared, or the humankind is not prepared to hear another negative message. We might control COVID 19, but get ready because what's coming will be much worse. Climate change or climate crisis, biodiversity destruction, this is much worse. Let's see whether we are able to change the narrative we are using right now. Those who are working with climate change, we have to be positive so that society, that all citizens understand that it has to do with themselves. The best way to change this narrative is establishing this link with health, a positive link. Every year, we have 7 million early deaths due to exposure to air pollution. 7 million deaths a year. It means in 10 years, 70 million deaths. We repeat these figures every day, but many people are not yet aware of them. And when we establish this kind of links, um, we have to make people understand this important link between climate change, air pollution, and health. And why is it? Because the causes for climate change, 75% of these causes are the same that lead to air pollution. And this burning fossil fuels, the fact that we use fossil fuels is a major contribution gives a major contribution to these 7 million deaths per year. And now the positive message. People already understand the strong link between air pollution and diseases, maybe asthma, children asthma, etc. They will not understand it's linked to lung cancer and other neurodegenerative diseases, long-term diseases. But they do understand that if the air is really polluted, they will not breathe well. The children with asthma will experience a higher number of episodes. So society is starting to understand the link between air pollution and health. This is why we are discussing air pollution in the framework of the climate change discussion. So COP26 this year has to convey very strongly this message. If we make decisions to fight climate change, you are making decisions that will be very beneficial to health. No, not co-benefits. straightforward benefits. The number of deaths will decrease. We will use a positive message. We'll point out the number of lives we are saving if we implement the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is not only environmental, does not concern only those who believe in the environmental struggle. We have to discuss health. If we can implement this Paris Agreement, this can be the most ambitious healthcare agreement, the most positive one over the last years.
So we need to consider physicians and everything we can do for them. Climate change, the environment, lack of diversity are all related to my health, to my children's health today. So we need to change this narrative. We can't just look forward down the road what the impact will be for us, for our families, for the planet, for the environment. Of course, that's important, but if we wish to engage the community, we need to talk about the impacts right now on myself, on my family. What can we do right now to contribute, to do something, to contribute to better this scenario through my vote? So we've had all the agreements on climate change that are related to health. Health has to be in the agenda, and whenever you take action to fight climate change, how many lives are you saving? How many people will not need health care for chronic diseases, which has a very high cost for society? So air quality, the benefits on air quality can be a strength, a major strength in our arguments. And secondly, we need to also change the food production system. The food system has to be more sustainable, diversified. We should consider change throughout the food chain, and we will have healthier diets, healthier production chains, control obesity and other problems. Malnutrition in many parts of the world. Once again, the public health community should also engage in such discussions and these debates and decision-making processes. And another important measure is, well, last year, the WHO realized it's not only about putting out a fire. We need to try and understand the causes that have produced this gloomy scenario we're living in. And yes, we're living in a critical scenario. We wrote the WHO manifesto for a green and healthy recovery, which consists of 6 points, 6 principles. The first is to curb or to stop actually fighting against nature, against diversity. That needs to stop because it will never bring any benefits to our societies, to our planets. We have to really build awareness. It's not just for Greenpeace activists. It's not a message that we want to send out to green activists. Everyone must understand that there's also a benefit for them. So, yes, the lack of access to drinking water and sanitation, water treatment. Well, everyone should be able to wash their hands, to have running water to wash their hands. And there are many people who cannot do that because they have no running water, no soap. This is another key gap we have to close. The third prescription, well, is a health prescription, although it seems, not too close to the health sector. A transition consists of a transition to renewable energy, clean energy, which will provide supply energy to all in a clean way. It can no longer use fossil fuels, which is also causing severe problems to mankind. And it should not, of course, produce the problems it has been producing. We can create more jobs with renewable energies than fossil energies. The health industry, once again, will play a key role there because depending on the energy source it decides to use, there will be, well, a major impact on people, cost for society, for health, the health system, and of course, we need to find balance. Third, prescription has to do with the food system, food production system, which should be more sustainable in terms of waste management. And 1/3 of the food that is produced globally goes to waste. It is thrown out, and that must change. The fifth principle has to do with cities, urban planning. And cities right now, our urban centers have polluted air. 90% of people living in urban centers are breathing polluted air, which is not actually in line with the WHO recommendations, and therefore they are breathing polluted air, and that, of course, has an impact on health and a cost for society. These cities, well, cars should not be at the center of urban planning. It should be rather humans, and urban planners should, of course, consider sedentarism, health, mental health disorders, and take many factors into account in their design to foster change. So healthy urban planning is also key. And the last prescription is about government authorities and about no longer subsidizing fossil fuels, considering the cost for healthcare, for the economy. We need to have a just transition for populations and to also create green jobs. And these, well, would be the 6 prescriptions we have in our manifesto for a green, healthy recovery or transition that is in line with the ecosystem, in harmony with the ecosystems. It can be an opportunity that we just heard of. We are actually tackling 3 emergencies: COVID-19, climate change, and the loss of biodiversity. Still, we have the opportunity to tackle all of these issues intelligently, strategically, and together to actually bring about change in production, consumption, and in the way we are living in urban centers. I think never before, we've never lived in such critical times as now, and science will bring the answers and solutions that we need. And after that, of course, we will need for people to get together and bring about change, science-based change going forward. Maybe, yes, well, we have to wait and see what the effects of the vaccines will be. And of course, we have great expectations there, positive expectations. So this would be all from my part for now. And I hope we have time for a debate later. Thank you. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Mrs. Neda. Well, for your talk, very clear, of course, comments on what we have to do and how to address all of these issues, these emergencies that we're facing now. Karen, over to you now. Thank you. Are we good now? Yes, we're good. So let's try to share your screen once again. As Maria Neira said, even Bill Gates struggles with with the same problem. So no worries. It happens to everyone. Well, yes. So, yes, it can happen to anyone. On the other hand, I always like to look at the bright side of things. I normally do that. So it actually was great because I will actually now summarize. My intervention will be brief because much has been said already by the previous speaker. Sergio, who is supporting me with the slides, will now share the slides. And as I was saying before, thank you, Sergio. I'm an environmental epidemiologist, and therefore I must, of course, make this link between these two areas. It's natural for me. I've been studying the Amazon region for many years now. And this image that you see on the screen is actually representative of the pandemic we are living right now and will be facing going forward. I was a nurse and epidemiologist, and I've always heard the following question, Karen, when will the pandemic be over? When is this going away? We can't take it anymore. We have a pandemic fatigue. When is it going away? And my answer is it will only go away when all countries, as Paulo also said in his presentation, have equal access to vaccines and to social, economic control systems and resiliency. And when we think about equity in the Brazilian context, well, how can we think about equity in this heterogeneous country, in this political context, which actually intensifies problems, and we have a complex epidemiologic scenario, and at the environmental level, it's even more complex. So I would like to begin by saying this because we've had the pandemic and the first wave and then the second wave, the second surge with more urgent infections that are not directly related with COVID infections. It brought about consequences that we have heard about and other effects that are prolonged because of the virus, economic, psychological effects that are also related to food insecurity, to the social, economic, environmental scenario in different countries. And in this scenario, and thinking about Brazil particularly and the Amazon region, which I will delve into now, if you have regions that are more developed economically when compared to the Amazon region, what to say of the indigenous communities, the quilombolas, for example, and the communities that have struggled traditionally to access the health system? How are they going to tackle and get over this pandemic if they don't have proper access to health systems? And of course, that hampers their lives, threatens their lives. So when it comes to air pollution, now I would like to talk about particulate matter, fires, in the Amazon forest and problems that were already happening before the pandemic, we can actually understand and realize that the virus can be carried by particulate matter, as we can see on the screen, as small as 2.5 micrometer in diameter. And we, of course, have to wear masks. There's also a political context that is related to that. And I would ask, what is actually the impact of the forest fires? They're burning the forests, especially after 2019. And how has that, what role does that play? Do those fires play in the virus spread? If the virus can be carried by these particles. And well, in asking myself this question, I thought, well, the Amazon has so many vulnerabilities, social, environmental, economic, health. And if there's no control in terms of deforestation and biomass burning, what can be done to address that? You had the problems in Manaus that we're all aware of, and maybe this environmental aspect was also an aggravating factor on top of all the other issues that have been presented and discussed here. So yes, this is a question I would like to bring to the table for reflection. Karen, in the meantime, if I may, just to make it more interactive, what particular issues did you make reference to regarding Manaus? Oh, in Manaus, you had, for instance, shortage of oxygen, no oxygen tanks for patients that were short of breath. And if you consider the political scenario and the social economic scenario in Manaus, you had, well, of course, a precarious health system. The pandemic brought about this new disease. More people were going to hospitals. Hospitals were overwhelmed. High and medium complexity treatment was required, ventilators, ICU units, and they were out of all of those things. They did not have a proper management system in place to address all of those issues in Manaus. And this is a critical context per se. And on top of all of those things, you have environmental issues, deforestation, fires. So these are aggravating factors that pose more risks for those people living in those communities to have more severe effects of the virus. And this was clearly shown, well, yes, in the previous presentation, studies and papers that have been produced indicating the relation between these particulate matters and the severity, the higher severity of the disease. So I would ask, would we in those regions, and I mean the Amazon region, particularly in this case, because it is a forgotten region. We only remember the Amazon region when there's a fire, when there's deforestation, or a major issue. But in the urban areas, where you also have high concentrations of particulate matter, maybe that was also an aggravating factor that also boosted the spread of the virus. So these are things we have to look at closely. And just to bring you some context, this is the question I bring to the table. Interpreters kindly ask you to speak more slowly. Thank you, Karen. Yes, I know I get carried away. Sorry about that.
It's a topic that I love, and so it's natural to get carried out. So there is a study group in Harvard that is devoted to this relationship between air pollution and increased mortality in the US. Papers are being published in the Lancet about planetary health, and this is a topic I'd like to propose for our discussion, our reflection in the Brazilian context. These are a few charts to illustrate what I'm saying. This is the specific information. These are evidence. This is evidence about this. This map shows the increase in CO emissions. I will not repeat what Paulo said, but it shows the increase of these fires, mainly last year, in the beginning of the pandemic. I took the example of the Pará state in the Amazon region. Together with Sandra Reiko group in the National Public Health School, we found a strong correlation between particulates and the increase in hospitalizations due to severe COVID-19 cases and outpatient consultations. And as it strikes me, we find there's a strong correlation between virus and the disease. Moreover, there are other factors, weak lockdown and social distancing, etc. This is the background. But we have this strong correlation. We have to ask ourselves how much it impacts daily life. And why this strong correlation? Let me explain this chart. In the Amazon, we have very definite seasons, rain and not rain. And forest biomass burning takes place during drought seasons, meaning from July to September, October. In this box plot, we can see the increase of relative risk, which is the likelihood someone will have a disease or develop a disease and die. This is the relative risk during dry seasons. There is a strong indication. This is based on mathematical modeling and other techniques, but this is a strong indication that this happened in the Brazilian Amazon region. And then I wonder if the Amazon keeps on increasing forest burning, and Sergio mentioned the possibility of new viruses being spread. When you lose biodiversity, you lose forest biomass. We have to wonder what will be the impact of the situation in a few years and the consequences of the pandemic in other areas, such as job losses, etc. I will not delve into this because this is not our topic, but I'd like just to stress the relationship between pollution and the situations and the impact it will have in the future, mainly for most vulnerable age groups, such as elderly people and children. Thank you. What I'd like to say in conclusion is that beyond the environment,
o desafio que a gente tem, na verdade, para poder enfrentar
what's the challenge we are facing in this area in Brazil? With our socioeconomic vulnerability and facing the increase of other aspects, other problems such as psychological aspects and pandemic fatigue.
do contexto amazônico.
So I tackled the Amazon context, the pollution problem, and the social inequality in Brazil. I'm sorry about the technical issues, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much. It's glad it's a good thing to have someone establish the link you did. In our first seminar, we discussed rather than a natural history of the planet, of the disease, and we still have to deal with the social history of this disease and our interventions in different areas with their consequences on the natural history. In our first seminar, in a very heated debate, we realized the Brazilian government has an intentional policy which we've seen on the number of standards or legislations it published, it adopted. Many have argued for the idea of having herd immunity, a natural herd immunity, as if we could naturalize the kind of death we are surviving. Over 550,000 families in Brazil have had to deal with. It's a huge impact on youth, on hope about the future. This youth sees its future melting down, and they have to deal with that. This is one of the impacts Maria mentioned, one of the relationships between both sectors. Many are commenting the final image of Paulo's presentation, the huge environmental wave, and the statement that this is the largest one of the three crises, and it requires an important policy effort. But there is something that changes a little our debate. Paulo or Maria and Karen might comment as well. We have to discuss the efficacy of masks. You've discussed that. Published by a physicist. Many read what you published, and many would like to know how you see the importance of masks for daily life. This was discussed yesterday and during our first seminar. Most affected people, well, Karen pointed out there is a huge inequality in terms of the indigenous peoples and Quilombola communities. In urban peripheries, people did not quarantine, they leave in small homes, and it's harder to keep social distancing. And not only that, they faced urban policies. You all mentioned our urban metropolitan structure, so as to say, what's not specific for Brazil, that makes public transportation much more important for the poorer, the less white population, and as in the case in Brazil, much more important for them than for other population groups. They are listening to our debate here. We make a point at including them here. And mask use is even more important in this context. In public transportation, in agglomerations, mainly for these populations. Yesterday, we mentioned the situation in Peru. We know what happens in Peru and Asia. Their work is based on selling things in the streets. How can we reflect on the effectiveness of different kinds of masks, the ones you studied, and the importance of masks or mask using for the environment? I've heard an argument saying that the number of masks that will be discarded will have a negative effect. We start already seeing masks discarded on the streets, etc. Would there be solutions for that? Changing a little bit the general topic, not forgetting the giant wave, the environmental wave, which was debated before COVID-19 in Brazil. Let's turn to something more of a daily life issue. We will only overcome this pandemic if the society as a whole would implement three measures. The first one is vaccination for all, or for at least 90% of the population. This is the most important measure by far. The second one, if there are no vaccines for everybody, keeping social distancing, stay at home. It's important to understand that this virus is airborne. And so if you increase the ventilation of the environments, you reduce the likelihood you get COVID even being at home. So ventilation is very important. And the third aspect, if you have to go out to work or use public transportation, always wear a mask. We've tested 280 types of masks in a study we published. And this shows that the better masks are the N95 masks, which have an effectiveness between 90 and 95% in the retention of particles that could contain SARS-CoV-2. And so after that, you have masks to buy in drugstores, the TNT fabrics, 75% effective. They are very good. The fabric masks that most use have an effectiveness between 30 and 70%. The worst fabric mask protects you for a very important part of the time. So we will have to keep on using masks or wearing masks until this epidemic is over. This is possible, but it requires long-term public policies that would be consequent. One question I have here. Good part of the community response to COVID. Let me give you an example. At the beginning, in Heliopolis, this is where I work, campaigns we set, wear masks, and we distributed masks. there was an infodemia, bad information distribution. These are Chinese masks. The virus came from China. Do not wear masks. We had to conduct a local work with community leaders to say masks are not Chinese. The solution this community found was twofold. First of all, raise funds to produce masks within the community with the seamstress, buying fabric, buying sewing machines, give jobs to many unemployed women, mainly cleaning ladies that were laid off, and invite women and a few men to produce masks. And their question is, what kind, when is it 30%, when it is 50%, because they distributed masks produced in the community. And so they built confidence or trust. And at the same time, they offered the local community an income possibility, generation possibility. When you say 30 or 50% in the case of fabric masks, what are your recommendations? First of all, fabric masks are efficient in reducing virus spread. If you are producing a fabric mask, use at least 3 layers of fabric. This is the ideal thickness. More than 3 layers will affect the breathability of this mask, meaning it will be harder to breathe through the layers of fabric, and then you open the mask to breathe easily, and the virus can enter your respiratory system. And so 3 layers of fabric. The mask has to be well adjusted to the face. You need that clip to clip it to your nose to avoid air, outside air going into your nose. Some University of São Paulo has a website called Respira Plus. It's written there. There are patterns for seamstress. And so this is the response from science in order to reduce virus spread. If you are in a closed space, open the windows to improve ventilation. All viruses are very vulnerable to ultraviolet radiation from the sun. SARS-CoV-2 does not survive in an external environment under the sun. And so ventilate your environment as much as possible. If you go to a restaurant, well, what do I do in a restaurant? I look for a place near a window, by the window, in a classroom where children will be, open all the windows or hold outdoors classes. All this would lead to control the pandemic. This was the second question about the sun in the air. Karen and Maria, do you have any comments to that? I'd like to comment on the vaccine because he stressed this point. We will need vaccines to tackle this pandemic and all the practices you mentioned. I read news about Brazil, and I'm very concerned about the new term we invented in Brazil. We came up with the vaccine sommelier. It's due to all the buying process, vaccine buying processes in Brazil. Well, the important thing is to get a vaccine, whatever vaccine you have access to. We have variants. We do not know the negative impact of the Delta variant, for instance, which is much more transmissible than the others, or communicable than the others. But we know that current vaccines are effective to fight these variants as well. So let me stress that. Get vaccinated. With whatever vaccine you have, A, B, or C, it's a vaccine, you will have an immune response, and this will lead to fighting the pandemic. I'm very concerned because the Delta variant is very communicable, and we in Brazil, we still have only 40% of the population vaccinated with the first dose. So this is what I'd like to stress, the importance of vaccination. It's crucial in Brazil. The more we vaccinate, the faster we will come up with a strategy for facing this, economic and social, etc.
Maria, any comments or remarks? Well, yes, if you consider a global, I have more of a global context or view, and you definitely have more information that is Brazil related. I know that through COVAX, we are attempting to curb this inequality. I fully agree that yes, people must get vaccinated. Everyone should get vaccinated. We have to accelerate the production, distribution, and acceptability among those populations that are not willing to get their vaccine. We do not believe in the vaccine. COVAX today is obtaining more funding with the World Bank and the World Trade Organization. The WTO is also considering technological transfer processes to accelerate the distribution of vaccines. There are mechanisms that are available to overcome obstacles to make vaccines as universal as possible. We have to vaccinate as fast as possible. The vaccine will be the answer. Science has brought this vaccine faster than ever. It has brought vaccines faster than ever before to the whole world, and we need to also look at equity and equality issues to really accelerate this distribution process. And once again, we should also continue the discussion about ventilation and access to solar energy, to wind energy, wind power, and we have to build awareness about these topics. And I think the process has started, but still when it comes to ventilation, we need to continue promoting this debate. It has to be part of our daily habits as a key measure to control the pandemic. This particular virus, but as Paulo said, any other virus as well. And above all, the coronavirus. Thank you. Well, so now, Maria, considering your words, we have one more question that is related to the topics that you brought forward. And a question related to the food system, food production system. Something that is clear to us. And yes, the interpreters are asking us to slow down, please. Something we have also found in the urban and peripheral communities, something that has worked positively has been heavy investments in community green gardens. Many different sites. So you can use all the open spaces that were used for different purposes. They are revamped and remodeled, renewed, and the community members can make their green gardens and orchards on those sites. I don't know if you are aware of such initiatives, but they have been working quite successfully in addressing the social economic impact and employment caused by unemployment, etc., which is affecting those communities and the fringes of the city, and also brings about this reflection about healthy diets and a healthy food chain. You said it's not enough to put out the fire, right, Maria? We have to go beyond that. So what we do on a daily basis, remember, bearing in mind, we depend as humans from the water we drink, the air we breathe, the food we eat. And when we teach the children, we tell them about these three aspects as critical aspects for survival. And, well, what would you be willing to share about this particular experience? Are you familiar with experiences of this kind in other regions of the world? The food production system, considering community vegetable gardens, something that could become an important way out to tackle the crisis. Maria?
Sim, ficou certo. Você sabe que
Well,
celebrar em Roma,
as you all probably know, there's a food summit that's being held in Rome, Italy. And there are panels about sustainable food production systems, holistic, strategic food systems, and one of the reports that have been produced by the summit is precisely to do with the role community agriculture or local agriculture or vegetable gardens can play as a solution for regions like the African continent, for instance. And you would have small farming production to feed the population. I'm not an expert in agriculture, but of course we need to have a global view, right, of things, of the global production systems, the food trading systems. A few years ago, there was the biofuels became trendy. How do you say that in Portuguese? It's similar, biocombustíveis, biofuels. Yes, of course. So, what happened? Well, you had environmentalists. It was an environmental action seeking to bring down CO2 emissions. In Brazil, for instance, large sites, large plots of land were used to produce such food through those, to produce foods through such food systems, and the prices went up drastically. So there are many things that should be taken into account. Diversified food production, in farming systems, trading systems, prices, impacts of the local production, the impacts to global trade. That is, well, you also have the slow food movement, right? Local production, health that is healthier. We are facing a severe public health problem as well. So, yes, the health industry is something we should focus on. And we have to be more intelligent and strategic because it plays a very important role. Thank you, Maria. Would Paulo and Karen like to add something to this reply? Would you like to contribute? Oh, Maria, if I may. Yes, it's precisely what's happening in the communities, in the fringes, in the outskirts, because of the crisis, of the unemployment. People are now eating bread rather than healthy food, right? They're eating bread and flour. And that is, of course, opposite to what you have just said and recommended. Anyone else? Oh, if I may, there's one more thing I'd like to say. Please go ahead. Yes, we are all focusing on healthy diets and, of course, tackling obesity, but we know we're also aware, well, of course, as much as we want for the population to eat fresh food from farm to table, to avoid processed food, well, we are aware that the prices are very different, right? Processed food is much cheaper than organic food, quote unquote. So we need to go beyond recommendations and really take all of these factors into account. So for families living in communities or low-income families, we really need to consider carefully how can they have access to healthy diets. It all starts with planning, farming, and in the food production systems. This is perfectly feasible, and in Brazil, you have all it takes to tackle all of these issues: biodiversity, deforestation, healthy diets, and hopefully this will also be sustainable, continue, and we'll look at the environment and health and more. Thank you. Thank you very much, Paulo. Participants are asking you to share the website once again, please, of Respira, right? Yes, just 1 moment, please. Fine, sure. Karen, you were going to say something? Yes, I was going to compare food safety in Brazil. Slow down, please. Okay, I think it's because I'm in Spain and everyone speaks so fast here. Oh no, by no means.
Demorou pouquinho. Eu não sei se o Paulo já quer aproveitar para falar.
There's a delay in the transmission. Go ahead, Karen. I'm still looking for the link. Yes, I was going to bring some context to all that Maria has just shared. My experience as someone living here in Spain, this is not my field of expertise, but I've realized that I know that Spain has a healthy city plan, as other cities in Europe, to, of course, drive healthy diets. And it all starts in school. They have a school program on healthy eating, healthy diets for children. And through this program, Healthy Cities, they had these incentive systems before the pandemic, the vegetable gardens, the community gardens. And that was previous to the pandemic. And in the case of Brazil, we lack so many things at so many levels: health and mask wearing. Paulo is going to share the website now, right, with the guidelines. So when you come down to healthy diets, it's so much more complex because you have food shortage in Brazil. People have no access to proper food. So how can we tackle all of those issues? Of course, alternatives arise, and in Sao Paulo, there's a growing number of vegetable gardens, but in the communities, in certain communities, it's still not easy to adopt such strategies. So what would the answer be there? Local trade to actually support local retailers, to create jobs in the community. So there are so many factors that we have to look at when it comes to yes, food safety and inequality in Brazil. Thank you, Karen. Okay, here's the website of the project HISPD, which means breathe in English, from the Innovation Center at the University of São Paulo. It's called innova.usp.br/projetos/respire. And you will find videos on how to make masks, which is the most appropriate kind of material. They have templates you can use, recommendations step by step. It's really helpful because, in fact, we are going to keep on wearing masks for, minimum 1 more year. In the US, some states lifted the mandate, and in 4 to 5 days' time, there was a peak in COVID cases in summertime. So yes, we have to come to terms with the fact, whether we like it or not, we'll have to keep on masking up until at least 80 to 90% of the population is vaccinated. Thank you, Paolo. Lorena, would you like to ask a question? Professor Lorena Barberia. We work together and we are actually organizing the COVID-19 network together, publishing bulletins. The 33rd bulletin was just issued. She's a political scientist. And over to you, Lorena. Thank you very much. I actually would like to say the following. There was a question that asked, Karen and Paulo, who talked about air pollution. It asks them to elaborate more on that and to share which are the studies that have been published about this topic and what is the link between those things and respiratory diseases. So these are the questions that are coming in. And I would also like to mention something about the challenge we're facing amidst the epidemic. We tend to think that everything is contaminated. Everything is contaminated. And actually, a lot of people are taking advantage of that, of this fact, to sell products that kill the virus, which they claim to kill the virus. You know, hand sanitizer and cleaning products. So, on one hand, we know there is an actual connection between the environment and the problems we are going through right now that caused this pandemic. On the other hand, some of the things that are claimed to cure are actually aiming to sell products and to produce more waste. And they will end up doing precisely what we're seeking to avoid, generating waste. So I would also like to have this discussion. In your opinion, how can we have more environmentally friendly products and change people's minds on when it comes to, being eager to buy or produce new products, produced with new technologies to kill the virus? Oftentimes, it's not an environmentally friendly technology that is used. These are very important questions. I'll try to answer the first one on the link between air pollution and COVID-19. So when you live in a city where there's a lot of pollution, air pollution, like Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, you're continuously breathing gas and particles that irritate your respiratory system. And the organism will react to that. It is as though you were permanently using a partially inflamed lung. It is as though your lung was constantly inflamed or hampered. And once COVID finds such conditions, it will rapidly actually be harmful, damage you, if your immune system is not as strong as someone who does not live in a polluted area like that.
It's very impressive to see the correlation between the number of COVID cases in cities with high pollution levels and cities with low pollution levels in the same region with the same age profiles, etc. So there is no doubt that air pollution worsens the disease and makes it easier to develop, to have COVID. And so I'd rather have epidemiologists to explain this better than I do. Paulo, I think that you will be declared a physician, not just a physicist, because this is really right. You are more vulnerable due to pollution, just like smokers. If you are a smoker, you will be more vulnerable. You will add a risk factor. Moreover, if you have the disease due to the virus, and if you have been exposed to air pollution for a number of years before that, you will more likely develop severe disease because, of course, you are much more vulnerable. And this is why I would like to repeat this. Fighting air pollution yields many benefits beyond the fact that breathing clean air is a basic human right, air that does not harm your health, just like drinking good water. We are not asking for the air quality you have in Switzerland mountains, of course, but we have to achieve the levels requested by the WHO. This would be basic. And if you add other risk factors, of course, your likelihood changes. And of course, people are constantly exposed to who are exposed to air pollution, they will develop chronic respiratory diseases that will make it even easier to develop or to get this virus. It's, after all, it's an airborne virus. Another issue that is also very interesting, we are creating a contradiction. We are saying it's important to respect the environment, but measures we are implementing will have an impact on the environment. This is a moment when society has to reflect. Masks, we have tons of masks, and they will end up in the environment. We will have this problem, very serious one. And we have to be very clear about how we will fight the virus. We do not need substances. I mean, we need ventilation, like Paulo said, ultraviolet light, very simple things, basic disinfection, basic hygiene, water and soap would be enough. And the population, as Karen said and Lorena said, need new technologies. They think they need that. In some places, they use very expensive, ineffective disinfection techniques. They are adding chemicals. We would not need to that. Let's get back to basic masks, vaccines, ventilation, and common sense about how to manage the risk level depending on where you are, and insisting on the importance of vaccination globally. Of course, we should vaccinate all the susceptible population. We're not yet there, but we will be. Let's be optimistic about this. Karen? Yes, I believe that Paulo and Maria were crystal clear about the physiological effect of the pollution and its relationship with the respiratory level. But about pollution, still about pollution, it works as an added risk factor. What would it be? Let me give you the example of cardiovascular disease, which is very easy to understand. If I eat a lot of fat, I have a higher likelihood to develop a heart attack. If I eat too much fat, in time, I might develop a heart attack. With the pollution, it's the same kind of reasoning. If I am constantly exposed, and it's impossible to avoid that, we breathe all the time, of course. If I'm exposed to high concentrations of pollutants, plural, not only one, our atmosphere is full of pollutants, what happens in our body? Well, it increases our likelihood to developing a respiratory disease or a cardiovascular disease, because it's also related to pollution, because our cardiorespiratory system is one. When we consider COVID, the seriousness of the COVID disease can increase. Cases that might be mild without this exposure to high concentrations are more likely to become severe in these regions. It's not a direct relationship. I will breathe this air, I will have COVID. It's not like that. But if I'm exposed to those pollutants, my likelihood to develop this illness and even to die is increased. And as to the second question, companies end up looking for survival means, which might be products that are not necessarily optimum to fight the epidemics. As Maria said, all water, soap, and alcohol, 70% are more than enough.
Eu acho que a gente tem tempo ainda.
I think we still have time for one last question, a general question for everybody. Lorena? No, I do have one.
Eu acho que eu, como alguém que trabalhou na pandemia.
I've worked with AIDS, HIV/AIDS, the HIV/AIDS pandemic since the beginning. I've seen the similarities and differences, as I've told you yesterday. I see that one of the most striking differences is the political context in the world. When at the onset of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, we faced conservative government, denial, mistrust, distrust on science, the stigma of affected people, but there was a movement that led to climate conferences, conferences against racism, population conferences of the 90s in the world. And AIDS contribute to that. And the response to AIDS was learned from that. The productive response, taking into account human rights that are the base of the UN Human Rights Chart. And this encourages us to think about parameters for global sustainable development. This is what we share through the UN system. My final question to you is, how can we deal with, or first of all, how do you see this change in the Brazilian point of view relative to human health and environment? How do you see that from a point of view of those who are not in Brazil? What happens with our leaders, with our Brazilian experience? What's the vision you have? How do you see Brazil, the Brazilian experience? What could we do beyond this kind of seminars? What could you do besides voting correctly, of course, casting a better vote in our next elections, voting everywhere? Could you see a difference between what happened in the US right after Biden elections, if that made a difference in global articulation in terms of how the country faces the environmental issue? Without a global response, it will not be tackled. Of course, you've all been clear about that, but also the way we tackle this health crisis. In summary, how do you see changes in Brazilian leadership, and how do we see that politics and voting made a difference in the US and in the global response to two problems that are global and require global and solidarity response? So here you are. I'm not Brazilian, but I will dare to start without really delving into Brazilian issues. But one reflection, a few years ago, not many, well, you know that the US government, our president, said that the US should not be a part of the Paris Treaty on Climate Change. This was a very critical moment. A very important country was withdrawing from the Paris agreements. All meetings we were by then included global governance. We had responses from governors, from mayors, the community, from the community. Let me use a phrase we used in Spanish. My parents and my grandparents used when we had Franco and the dictator Franco in Spain. They used to say, against Franco, we had a better life, meaning that when they were together against something with one cause, they got to do a lot. What do I mean by this? Well, of course, voting is crucial. in order to have a good political leadership. I'm not judging what is good, what's not good. Of course, I do not pretend to know, but citizens' vote is very important. Not only voting for president, but also for mayor and even for local levels such as school, communities, etc. These votes have a huge impact. Now, when these leaders are not as good as we would wish, we can create other associations, other networks, other forces. We should not remain be paralyzed in anger, frustration, sadness. These are feelings that paralyze us. It's frustration. We have to be in public health. We have to be optimistic. This is a matter of survival. We should look for a parallel systems. In medicine, when a vein is not working, we look for another one. For the heart, we look for alternate systems or circuits. We should do this not against math, but for a cause that might be climate change. The third point is it's true that the US during those hard times, they kept on acting. And the third thing is society and citizens have to be on our side. I mean, you can have the better idea ever, the best idea ever. You can propose a very crucial movement, but if you do not have people's support, the idea might remain as an elite idea, supported by vegetarians or by those who have electrical cars and then people who could recycle. No, we have to democratize this sustainability and environmental cause. And to do so, we might use in a very opportunistic way people's health. This is a language that will reach every consciousness. In London, there is a DA that recognized for the first time that a death certificate of an 11-year-old girl due to asthma, if he recognized that the cause of death was air pollution. This is a small step, but it's a great step for humankind because it means that the mother of that child that was not a physician or an expert, she understood that the air her child used to breathe was related with her child's death, and so she became an environmentalist. We used to say there is no planet B. We should say there is no lung B. Of course, we have two lungs, but we do not other lungs which would replace our lungs and all the rest of the body, of course, because air pollution affects the whole body. I hope that Brazil could be a leader. Well, having a good leadership helps, but I mean the society, your scientists, your universities, etc. Thank you very much. Let me answer very quickly because we are almost over here. Let me answer various questions. A pandemic made clear a division we had in society between extreme right, far right governments and population interests. The conflicts due to inequalities in Brazil and in US was extreme. And countries such as New Zealand, where inequalities are not very important, they deal with all this in a very clear way. Why was the far right in Brazil against lockdown or mask using? It indicates that the social and economic situation was normal for them. They were concealing the emergency from the population. And why was this? Because those who earn money when the economy is normal are those who invest, who are very rich, and not the regular worker who earn salaries, who have to use public transportation in a crowded train and expose their health, their lives, so that other people earn a lot of money from their work. And this is very important. The message from the far right is, you poor people, you go to work because I need to earn money from that work, no matter how many of you get sick or die. So work precarization during the pandemic was huge. You can see the iFood, etc. But we have to reverse this. We have to build a society who would respect other people's lives, poor, rich, no matter whom. And this was made very clear during this pandemic. Other people's life is taken for granted in Brazil or in the US when with far-right governments. Let's hope, as Maria said, that those governments go away and we rebuild the solidarity pathway. Let's think about taking everybody into account. Let's understand that a vaccine is a solidarity mechanism. It's not that you were going to get a vaccine, it's the society who is being protected.
Thank you, Paulo. Gladly, in the US, the scenario has changed. The administration has changed. Still, it's challenging.
Passamos o tempo,
Well,
né?
I know we are pressed for time. Yeah, so I will be brief and in a nutshell would add to what Paulo just said that the greatest challenge we are facing when it comes to far-right governments is the despise towards science, denial, and actually denying scientific evidence and focusing more on the economy and other interests. That's what happened with Trump, the Trump administration, who recommended the population to take disinfectant. People became intoxicated and some died. It's outrageous. It's unbelievable, right? And so this would be the reflection I would present. And now, with the new administration, the curve is going down. The number of cases are going down, and vaccination is, of course, happening everywhere in the United States. And public authorities who are for science will actually, of course, promote and bring about more appropriate action and further control the pandemic. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you, Paulo, Maria from WHO, Karen, now living in Spain. Thank you to all of you for your inputs, for this interesting debate. And our next speakers are already in the room. Panel. Welcome to all of you. And thank you for accepting our short notice invitation.
Barbieri.
Agora, em meio à pandemia,
Então, with you, Aratu, if you may introduce yourself and the others.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Aratu Castro, and I'm the Samuel Stone Chair of Public Health in Latin America at the School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine at Tulane University in New Orleans. And I've been working throughout Latin America for more than 20 years in different countries. By the way, I've been asked to speak English today, but I was enjoying the conversation in Portuguese just before this. And yeah, very much. And well, I worked on HIV for many years throughout the region and in other infectious diseases. And when I've also worked a lot on maternal and child health, and when the pandemic started, I started immediately to work on the impact that the pandemic could have on health services for women, children, and adolescents in the region. And I've been conducting research on this topic since, mostly through the ISLAC project, which is a collaboration between Tulane and the University of Santiago de Chile. And we have, as expected, the indirect effects of the pandemic in health services have been devastating. And we are now estimating the impact on health outcomes. But already last year, I estimated that the impact on maternal and child mortality would be really, the deaths would be increasing a lot, and that many countries in the region could go back to the levels where they were 10 to 20 years ago. So that is very disturbing. And but I like now to introduce our speakers today. And we have Raymond Dutch, who's the director of the Nuffield Center for Experimental Social Sciences at Oxford University, who is going to speak about vaccine hesitancy and ideology in Europe and the US. After Raymond, we'll have Lorena Barberia, my dear friend and colleague of many years, and who is a professor at the University of Sao Paulo, and she's going to speak about vaccine hesitancy and ideology in Brazil. And after Lorena, we'll have Elena Barham, who is a PhD candidate in political science at Columbia University, who will speak on vaccine hesitancy in Latin America. So I would like now to have Raymond Dutch, if he could turn on the video, and it'll be great to have him present.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, cool, great. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to spend some time with you. And I was going to share my screen if I could. So again, thank you for the generous introduction, and I'm going to talk about. I think the last panel ended on the right note, which is basically, politics matters, and we need to think about how politics is going to shape what we hope will be the end of this pandemic, but the sort of transition from this pandemic to probably some sort of equilibrium that actually recognizes the importance of public health issues like the threat of pandemics. So I'm going to talk about how partisanship and ideology matter here. And the project really is one that we started last year. It's centered in Oxford. It's called the Candor Project, And the project is focused on trying to understand public attitudes and public behavior related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have teams throughout the world. We have teams working in Latin America, in Colombia, in Chile at the University of Santiago, Chile. We have people working in North America and Canada, Japan, Uganda, France, Spain. So we have a very diverse group. And the idea here is to pull this diverse group together to allow us to figure out globally how politics, this short theme, this short area that I'm going to talk about today, how politics matters for the COVID-19 pandemic. We have been conducting this project in 13 countries. We're expanding it to 20 countries. The data that I will talk about today is mostly from a work that we conducted in November through December of 2020. And the original focus of that project was to understand how government should prioritize the allocation of vaccines, how government should deal with vaccine hesitancy, how government should think about the post-pandemic period in which we think governments are going to be faced with this challenge of investing in public health and institutions that'll allow us to sort of be much more resilient and much more responsive if we do get another pandemic. The focus today will be on a theme that was brought up at the end of the last panel, which is partisan differences regarding the COVID-19 vaccine. And this is a result that was published recently regarding the US attitudes towards vaccinations. And what it essentially shows is that Democrats and Republicans have had very different evolutions of opinions regarding the COVID vaccine, general vaccine attitudes, and even flu shot attitudes over the course of the March through August period of last year, when there was a heated partisan discussion about COVID and whether individuals should be vaccinated or whether vaccines were appropriate. So there clearly is, in the U.S. This partisan divide on the issue of vaccines. This will be my point of departure for discussing the global situation with respect to partisanship and attitudes towards the vaccine and towards COVID. I think a lot of media attention has focused on the U.S., and typically in the U.S. things are exaggerated, and clearly the partisan differences on this issue have been exaggerated in the U.S. But also, as we were discussing at the end of the last panel, there's a certain partisan division also within Brazil, right? So the question is, how global is this partisan difference? Is this something that's sort of unique to a couple of countries like Brazil and the US, who happen to have sort of interesting leaders at the time of COVID? Or is it the result of some more global phenomenon? And I think it's important to understand that. So in the 17 countries where we conducted the survey, we did ask in all of these countries a question. We asked people to place themselves on a left-right self-placement scale. This simply sort of presents results for 6 of the countries, Brazil, Australia, Chile, France, the US, and Italy. And what it suggests is that our positioning of the citizenry in these 6 countries looks very similar to how other surveys have positioned the electorate in other countries. Now, unfortunately, Brazil is there, and I don't know much about Brazil, so I don't know whether this makes sense or not. But certainly, I can say the other ones make perfect sense. But clearly, Brazil seems to have a skew to the right. And most of the other countries seem to be sort of more or less normally distributed. But this suggests at least that our left-right self-placement measure, which is the basis for everything I'm going to talk about in the presentation, makes some sense. So this is sort of the explanatory variable that I think is important here, right? Does this variable explain people's responses to COVID, vaccine, government policies regarding COVID globally? And the punchline, before I present any of the data, is there does seem to be some reasonable evidence in the data that I'll present that, yeah, ideology matters, not just in the US and in Brazil, but there does clearly seem to be this sort of left-right division in terms of how the electorate is responding to this pandemic, which is quite interesting. I mean, I think, but it's also a point of departure, I think, for policymakers when they start thinking about policies, either current policies or future policies. I think they really do need to understand that the electorate is not uniformly supportive of these policies. There are divisions in all countries. So I'll just give you an overview of the results and just a snapshot of the attitudes and behaviors that seem to be shaped by these ideological divisions in this global survey. And I should point out, the global data that I'm presenting represents about half of the global population. So it includes India, China, the US, Canada, France, Spain, the UK. So it's quite, and it includes Brazil, Colombia, and Chile. So it is pretty representative of the global population. So here, I'm simply looking at vaccine hesitancy, right? And I'll just give a synopsis of this result. So we asked people about their intention to get COVID-19 vaccines. And this analyzes about 25,000 observations from these 17 different countries. And on the question about whether people are intended to get the COVID-19 vaccine, of course, this was November, December 2020, there is some evidence that ideology matters. Clearly, countries matter. So there seemed to be enthusiasm amongst a lot of the developing countries, Uganda, Brazil, India, and there tended to be a little bit of sort of hesitancy on the part of, in particular, France, but and Italy. So the left side is opposition, and the right side is enthusiasm. But what's important from my sort of little narrative is that ideology matters. It's one of the ideology equals 4 and the ideology equals 3 here is suggesting that left-leaning citizens tended to be significantly more enthusiastic about the COVID-19 vaccine than was the case for citizens who had other ideological perspectives. Although here it's not that strong. I would say it's weak, but it's indicative or suggestive. We then asked people whether they were concerned about vaccine side effects. And here there's a strong ideological division, right? The right are very concerned, expressed strong concerns about vaccine side effects. And you can see that in this upper right-hand corner, because you see ideology equals 10, which is the most right-wing, ideology equals 9, ideology equals 8, should put my glasses on. Ideology equals 5. So there's clear evidence that people who identified on the right were very concerned about vaccine side effects at the end of 2020. We also asked people whether they were concerned with vaccine efficacy. Same result, right? And you'll also notice that Brazil was very concerned, also Colombia, Spain, and Chile. I think, and this is, this is speculation, I think the reason that these countries were particularly concerned about vaccine efficacy was because of the sort of less effective brands that were being distributed, particularly in Chile, for example, where the Chinese version was preeminent. So I think there was some skepticism in those countries about these brands, but that's total speculation. What's important here is that ideology matters. The right here clearly were very concerned about vaccine efficacy, and it's a strong effect, and it's again, it's consistent with the previous effect about concern with side effects. So this is not just a US phenomena, it clearly is, in my opinion, a global phenomenon. We also asked about vaccine distribution. We asked people their opinions about how vaccines should be distributed, how governments should deal with the problem. And here we have mixed results. We asked people whether they thought government should mandate vaccines. This has become much more relevant today than it was at the end of last year. But here we don't see much of an ideological effect at all. So it seems like the left and right, at least at the end of last year, were similarly, I would almost say, indifferent about this issue about government mandates. But when we asked whether they thought employers should be allowed to enforce vaccinations, you then see an ideological perspective emerging where the right seems somewhat enthusiastic about this. But I wouldn't put too much into that. The last slide with respect to distribution, I think really is the most critical one. And that is, we asked people whether they thought vaccines should be a personal choice. Now, when you frame it as a personal choice, there's a very strong ideological effect. The right are very adamant that vaccines should be a personal choice, and the left are clearly much less concerned about this notion that vaccines should be a personal choice. I mean, suggesting that they're much more sensitive to sort of the public good fallout from vaccinations. But clearly on the right, when it's framed as an issue about personal choice, there's strong opposition to the notion that vaccines should be forced on people. So punchline here, a second indicator, the issue about how they should be distributed and whether government should force people to be vaccinated. Some evidence, again, globally, that there's an ideological effect and that the right are much more hesitant about forcing individuals to be vaccinated. And so it's, again, not a US, not an explicitly Brazilian phenomenon, but in some sense a global phenomenon. The third series of questions we asked, which I think were quite interesting in this and totally serendipitous, to be honest, we asked people about vaccine redistribution. And one question we asked was whether, and this we asked only in the developed countries, whether the public was supportive of their national government donating COVID-19 vaccine doses to low-income countries. And here we got a really surprising result. What the graphs are suggesting essentially is that in all of the countries, at least a majority of the population supported redistribution of COVID vaccine. So it's very surprising. I mean, that's you rarely get a result like that from in public opinion, and so a majority of the respondents in these countries clearly supported redistribution, but typically about at least 40% of the population supported more than 10% of the stockpiles being redistributed, which is pretty significant. So the notion that this notion that governments are hesitant about redistributing stockpiles because of public opinion is probably wrong, right? I mean, most of these developed countries, the public is pretty enthusiastic. Now, of course, our interest, again, given the theme, is whether ideology matters here, whether this partisanship that sort of prevails is relevant. And it is, actually. So if I can move my screen. Okay, so what have I done here?
So maybe what we could, if you all agree, maybe we could have Elena started, and given that Ray was almost done, and then we can have Elena speak, and after sorry, was Lorena next? No, Lorena is next. So sorry about that. So Lorena, maybe you could go ahead, and after you're finished, and before Elena starts, if Ray's back, we can give him a few minutes to finish his presentation.
Okay. Okay, can you see my slides? So thanks, Arachu. I think the reason I'm in the middle is because I'm building a little bit off of the same conversation that we're having with Ray, and that we were just listening to Ray speak about. I'm going to be speaking about vaccine hesitancy and ideology in Brazil, and this is joint research. This is joint research with Isabel Costa Rosa, who we've been working on this project together. And part of it, I'm also going to be talking about research that we've been doing with other colleagues on social media and what is happening in social media on the politics of vaccines in social media. So I'm going to talk about what is first to try to help establish some of the evidence for what I'm going to talk about, and an interpretation of what's going on when I talk about ideology. I think it's really important, and I'm going to talk about some of the evidence that we have from social media and speech, and what it's telling us about the political context in which COVID-19 vaccines are being developed and deployed, talking about specifically the Brazilian context. And I'm going to try to show to you a little bit about vaccine branding and how it is affecting the willingness of Brazilians to take vaccines using survey data from January 2021. And then looking at how ideology is impacting the willingness of Brazilians to take vaccines from data in 2021, and how these, and from what Ray also signaled, there's a little bit of, when we look at ideological self-placement, there's a little bit of uncertainty about when we ask individuals to say on the left-right spectrum, we do tend to get disproportionately higher rates of right-oriented voters in Brazil. And so because of that, one of the ways that we're going to try to look at a more robust analysis is to look at income, to see if the same issues that we're getting in terms of how ideology is affecting vaccination willingness, if that happens the same thing when we look at income. And I see that Ray is also back. So Ray, we plan that I will present and then you'll come back.
Yep, I got the chat note, so that's perfect.
Okay, perfect. So we know, what do we know from past studies of vaccination is that vaccine willingness is influenced by expert information, but also by misinformation and by community norms. And what we know during COVID-19 is that the amount of information that has been flowing from experts and non-experts and the amount of misinformation has been extremely intense and very also interactive. So it's very common for us to see fake news and misinformation being disseminated, and experts rapidly interacting and reacting to that information and speaking to that information. And so one of the things that's interesting about this, and we have research on this in the background, but I think one of the things that is also unprecedented is we never had so much interest in that in the country of origin of the manufacturer, in what's going on in a phase 3 trial or an effectiveness study of a vaccine, and how that affects vaccination willingness. Because if we think about past vaccines, most of the time these vaccines we had being deployed, and there was a single or a couple of manufacturers that are identified where we didn't have the level of variation and the heterogeneity that we have today in how vaccines have been developed and the types of vaccines that are available at this moment. There's also some research that suggests that there's people are sensitive to whether the inoculation program is through the public health system or through private distribution, and whether it's mandatory or voluntary. So in the Brazilian context, I'm going to just try to situate a little bit and give further context. I'm going to talk a little bit about the clinical trials and the regulatory approval, because I think it's important for understanding what's happening with vaccination in Brazil. I'm going to show some really quickly just some evidence of what we mean when we talk about the role of the federal government, and particularly the president, in promoting false information and attacking specifically vaccines, how this relays or how it reverberates in social media, and then just speaking a little bit or just showing some of how this also reflects on vaccine variation across time, because what's happened in Brazil is we have different vaccine supplies that are arriving and leaving Brazil or being used in Brazil, and some vaccines and some brands are running out of supply. So really quickly, just to explain, clinical trials for vaccines, there was 4 clinical trials that took place in Brazil. We had AstraZeneca and the Sinovac vaccine that started clinical trials, phase 3 clinical trials in October. Pfizer and Janssen were also undertaking clinical trials in Brazil. And this is important because in that moment, those vaccine trials, those phase 3 trials were approved by the federal government. The federal government was aware of those vaccines being strong candidates. And later on, as those vaccine trials ended, those same manufacturers petitioned the federal government for authorization. And in particular, AstraZeneca had an agreement so that the vaccine would be developed and would be eventually manufactured at Fiocruz in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, and Sinovac entered in an agreement with Butantan in the University Institute here at the University of São Paulo, who would also manufacture and distribute the vaccine locally. So these 2 vaccines, first, they were important. It's important to understand they're vaccines that they were the first vaccines that started to be used in clinical trials. And these are the 2 vaccines that also could be manufactured locally. And this is important because if we all remember 2020, one of the discussions is, will we have enough vaccines? And we need to diversify production capabilities to the global south. So over time, what happened, and the survey data that I'm going to be showing you, is when we only have emergency use authorization for CoronaVac and AstraZeneca in Brazil, even though other vaccines are already approved. For example, the FDA had already approved Moderna and Pfizer by this time. Sputnik had already been approved by Russian regulatory authorities. The first vaccines that in the Brazilian context could be used in the population were only approved in January of 2021, once the phase 3 trial data was submitted to regulatory authorities. And later on, we've seen full approval for Pfizer. AstraZeneca has also received full approval, and a more restricted authorization has been granted to the Russian vaccine Sputnik. So how does that play out? It plays out that in the case of Brazil, if we look at the rollout of the vaccine, and here we're looking at the first dose and the second dose, what we can see, and the reason I'm bringing out this slide to try to underscore is I want you to show you, to underscore how much vaccine supply varies by month in Brazil. So if we look at the slide on the left is the first doses. If you see at the beginning, we have mostly CoronaVac and AstraZeneca being available. There's a really important problem with delays in AstraZeneca arriving in Brazil and being deployed. And so the predominant strategy that was used in Brazil until April is CoronaVac. And after that, you see that AstraZeneca overtakes the influx of first doses arriving. Why is that? Because we start to have problems with the distribution and the arrival of the active pharmaceutical ingredients for CoronaVac to be manufactured. And more recently, we start to see an influx and the arrival of Pfizer in Brazil. So it's important to understand currently in Brazil, there's 4 vaccines, 4 brands that are being deployed. At the time that I'm going to be reporting the survey data, I'm looking at the period of January 2021, when there's still not a lot of certainty around which vaccines Brazil is going to be using. And also there's a lot of understanding early on that the rollout is going very slowly, and the arrival of these vaccines, several contracts haven't been yet finalized. So Pfizer, for example, the contracts with Pfizer by this time hadn't yet been announced. In social media, just really quickly, and I'm not going to try to spend a lot of time, I'm just going to show this because I think it's important for understanding the survey data and understanding the results we're getting. There's a lot of information in social media that we've been able to collect about the attacks specifically against the CoronaVac. So as a reminder, President Bolsonaro, similar to President Trump, makes various statements accusing China of releasing the virus, of having a role in the promotion of the crisis across the globe, and also has a lot of political disputes with the Brazilian governor of the state of São Paulo, João Dória. And so because of that, there's also a conflict. Since the CoronaVac vaccine is being developed in the state of São Paulo, there's a lot of rivalry, and that generates attacks against this specific vaccine by the federal government. So this is just a quick slide that shows the blue and the green is the pro-CoronaVac Twitter tweets, and the blue is the anti-CoronaVac tweets. So it's showing the share of all of the tweets on CoronaVac that we've coded in different epidemiological weeks in 2020 when the clinical trial is taking place. This is the amount of attacks that are being made against the vaccine. And what we're trying to just underscore is for several weeks in which the clinical trials were underway, in which this is one of the most important and only vaccines identified to be used in Brazil, there's repeated strong attacks against this vaccine made in social media. And in some weeks, more than 90% of Twitter activity is against this vaccine by Bolsonaro allies, including congressmen and government members of his government and members of his administration. And so this is just showing even that the president participates in tweeting and in making these types of statements. He states specifically that this is the Chinese vaccine, and he makes specific references against the effects and the side effects of vaccines, including Pfizer. But there's a very pointed attack by the Bolsonaro administration around vaccines in general. The president still refuses to take a vaccine and to this date hasn't been vaccinated. And he continues to make statements in YouTube videos, in Twitter against the vaccines. The same thing, this is just showing the same thing by his allies and what is occurring in terms of the responsiveness and how much likes I want these tweets generate. So just a second, just as an example, when there's a tweet criticizing because the governor comes out in favor of mandatory vaccination in Sao Paulo, Governor Doria, there's 19.1 thousand likes for a tweet protesting mandatory vaccination. And this continues in throughout the vaccine trials, and we continued tracking this traffic in 2021. So I'm going to now just quickly go to the survey data and the results we have. So this is a survey that we've been looking at about 1,968 individuals. That the interesting thing about this survey, unlike many of the surveys that ask about vaccine hesitancy, is that in this survey, we found the information that asks, when a vaccine is approved by Anvisa, the regulatory agency, will you get vaccinated? And for the first time, this question appears yes, no, or it depends on the vaccine that is available. And so we were really interested in that third category, because that third category is a new type of vaccination hesitancy that we need to understand more carefully, which is that it might not be that individuals are vaccine hesitant in general, but they're vaccine hesitant to certain types of vaccines. And this is showing the descriptive statistics of those three groups. What I want to call attention to is the green is those who are in favor of getting a vaccine. That category dominates, and it dominates across regions of Brazil, across gender, across age groups. We have strong information that most of the population, the majority, are in favor of getting a vaccine. But importantly and strikingly, there's a strong percentage of the population, which is about 20% in each region of Brazil, that conditions vaccination on the vaccine that's being offered. And this information, when we first saw it, was very striking to us. Going back to what Ray was showing, if we look at ideology, this just reinforces that in that same poll, what Ray was drawing attention to, we do have a stronger share of voters that identify with the right and the extreme right in Brazil. And remember that President Bolsonaro is in government right now and continues to have 30% approval. So it's important to understand that there's a legitimate group of voters in Brazil who identify with the right. And so what we're going to try to do is look at, in the next couple of figures I'm going to show, is vaccine acceptance by these three groups, who is yes, who is no, and who depends on the vaccine. And here what we're looking at is income. And when we look at the lowest income group, what you can see is the group that depends on the vaccine is much higher in the right and extreme group for the lowest income group, and for the center, right? And much lower for extreme left and left. And when we look at the same thing for the highest income group, we actually in the highest income group don't have voters who identify with the left or extreme left, which I think is something interesting and noted that we should note. And the group that depends on the vaccine that shows up in that category is the extreme right high income voter that is saying that it depends on the vaccine. So there's definitely something that seems to be happening, even if we look at and considering income, ideology seems to be picking something up. So we ran a multinomial logistic model where the factors that we're controlling for is gender, age, education, income, and whether the voter resides in urban areas. And we looked at these 5 categories of ideology that are self-placed. And we look at how that affects the 3 categories, being a yes, being a no, or being willing to vaccinate conditioning on the brand of vaccine that's offered. And what we see here, and this is the slide that I think is the most important and is the kind of result of our research, is just to call attention to that when we look at, this is presenting the multinomial results of the predicted probability that an individual will get a vaccine. So what we see is overall, the yes group is very high in all ideological categories, but the percentage of people who are highly probable to get a vaccine, when we take into consideration their gender, their age, all of the other factors, and we hold those factors at the values that they are observed, what we see is that people on the left are 80% willing to get a vaccine. But that starts to fall, and by the time we get to the extreme right, that falls to about 50%. So there's definitely a decline as we see individuals self-identifying more towards the right. And if we look at the maybe category, which remember, again, the maybe category is saying, I'm willing to get a vaccine depending on the vaccine, that group, and the no category, I will not get a vaccine, though there's an increasing proportion of voters who identify with the right and extreme right, who are also more likely to be in those categories. Those categories are as high enough as 20% of the people in the case of no, and much higher in the case of conditional vaccination, and for as you can see in the maybe group. So this is interesting for us, and it's very important for us as a finding, because I think it helps to also understand what I'm talking about at the beginning, that there was a lot of pressure by Bolsonaro voters to prefer certain vaccines and signal certain vaccines as being more legitimate than others. And we're seeing that there's certain groups that are more susceptible, or that are more identify with more of that type of messaging and prefer certain type of vaccines. So we think that this research is really important for helping to understand the context in which vaccination and vaccines have been studied in Brazil. We're starting to see some research where we're actually seeing that there's a very important difference depending on ideology about how one participates in the vaccination campaign. And this is important for thinking about how we deploy the vaccine in Brazil. It's important for thinking about messaging. It's important for thinking about lots of different consequences, also as we think about globally what's going on with vaccine passports and other things. So that's the end of my presentation. Thanks for everyone for listening. Ray, we're back to you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lorena. And Ray, you were, I think that when you were presenting, you were stuck in number 16, and we couldn't see the following one. So if you want to go back to that one, it'd be great.
I will give you the punchline on that. That was 16 was people think surprisingly large. Can everybody see me and hear me?
Yes,
Oh,
Trey, thank
okay.
you.
I'm now getting nervous. So
No. We are all sitting here hearing you and looking at your slides. That's fine. Thank you.
Large amount of support for redistributing stockpiles to low-income countries. And the punchline here on ideology, I'll just give the punchline, is that there's a strong relationship. As you might expect, the left, this is what this graph shows. You see the left ideologues up in the top right-hand corner, they're the ones who are much more likely to support redistribution. And then you see the right ideologues down here, 9 and 10, being less enthusiastic about redistribution. So that's the punchline. I'd like to just finish, I think, building on what Lorena was saying, and that is, one of the challenges that we had as a result of this research is people have come to us and said, well, how are we going to now get these right-wingers or these Trump supporters to vaccinate? I mean, that's the problem, right? We've got to get them to, and the US, of course, is now faced with a situation where, you know, they've done well at vaccinating, but the last 30 to 35% are, they're not getting vaccinated. And this is a problem. So we have, we conducted a set of experiments in the US, literally in the last couple of weeks, looking at whether vaccine incentives are a plausible strategy for getting people more enthusiastic about being vaccinated. And as you probably have heard, most of the US states now have different kinds of incentives offered people who get vaccinated. And our interest was trying to figure out which of these incentives would work. And related to the theme of this panel, whether they would work with partisans. So in other words, whether they would work with both Democrats and Republicans. So the experiment is, the experiment basically involved identifying, that's what this graph suggests, identifying people who were not vaccinated. That's the first stage. Those who were vaccinated were eliminated. We then identified about 1,800 people who were not vaccinated. This is an online experiment. We then randomly allocated those people to a classic CDC health video, 45 seconds. We then, people were also randomly assigned to a lottery video. Basically, the first 30 seconds looked like the CDC video. The last 15 seconds offered people a lottery. And if I can manage it, I'll show you the video. And then the third video was same health message in the first 30 seconds, but the last 15 seconds reference cash payments. And what we've been trying to figure out as a policy issue here is whether lotteries work, because lots of people are using lotteries. Those have been highly touted, and whether they work over a standard health message or whether cash incentives are what works. That's the basic experiment. Okay, let's see if this works. Can you see it?
The U.S. is working hard to distribute the COVID-19 vaccines, free for everyone with no strings attached. COVID-19 vaccines are safe and effective. After you've been fully vaccinated, you can resume activities that you did prior to the pandemic. In some states, those who have had at least one COVID-19 vaccine shot will automatically be entered into a lottery. Some of these lotteries will pay winners over $1 million in cash. If you get vaccinated, you could get rewarded. If you're interested in more information about getting a COVID-19 vaccine shot in your state, please click on the link that will appear once this video ends.
Okay, now let me go back. So the punchline is, do these incentives work, right? And the interesting thing about the experiment is that lotteries don't work. What really works are cash incentives. So these are the interactive results with different socioeconomic characteristics. But the only significant treatment effect here was the cash video. The lottery video was basically no different than the standard CDC health message. And that's an important, at least there's a big debate in the US about what we should be doing, how we should be trying to incentivize vaccinations. And the result is really interesting because it suggests lotteries are not the way to go, but cash is. With some nuances, as you might see in these results. And the nuance that's really important to us is this lower right-hand side, and that is there's also this preference for cash lottery, cash incentives is consistent for both participants who are in high Trump vote states and low Trump vote states. So the interesting thing here is not only is the cash incentive effective, but it also seems to be effective across partisan groups, across both Republicans and Democrats. The one result that's suggests some interesting interaction effect is race. Clearly, blacks are similarly impressed by both the cash and the lottery incentive. And the punchline of this effort is that this is the kind of effort that I think we need to sort of make, and this is the kind of evidence we need to sort of assemble in order to understand exactly how we're going to be able to sort of deal with this last 35, at least in the US, this last 35%, because standard approaches to getting them vaccinated are probably not going to work. So we should be thinking about innovative approaches, but innovative approaches that are backed up by hard data. And so that's my last slide. So thank you for your patience, and sorry about the problem.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. And now we have Elena Barham from Colombia.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. So I think that my presentation is going to speak really nicely to the other two discussions because we are focusing in Latin America, but we're also looking at the group of vaccine hesitant and trying to see what are some different kind of like public messaging or vaccine campaign design things that can help to address hesitancy among the vaccine hesitant. So this is going to be shared work that I'm presenting with Pablo Argote, Sarah Daly, Julian Jerez, John Marshall, and Oscar Pocasangre, who are all also at Columbia University. And we were kind of motivated to take on this project just also by this situation of hesitancy towards vaccination, which I think has become increasingly into sharper focus also with the emergence of additional variants, right, which have kind of continued to move the bar for what we're going to need to achieve herd immunity and are continuing to be, and that this kind of last 35% that we keep talking about, that either in the US or other countries that have had vaccine access, can kind of continue opening us up to risk of variants. So I know that access in Latin America is not where it is in the US, but I think it's great that we're kind of thinking about these issues now prior to that last group meeting to get vaccinated. So I don't know that I need to really overview the Latin American context for anyone here, but I think it's important to acknowledge that it's been one of the worst affected regions so far by the coronavirus for a lot of different reasons. And we do find ourselves in this context across the world of growing misinformation about the science of vaccines, which has been exacerbated by right-wing and populist politicians. And so what we try to do in this project is draw more on social science frameworks to start to address vaccine hesitancy among the hesitant. And so we're asking what are some private and social factors that generate hesitancy and how can they be overcome? And so to do this, we're going to draw from 3 different social scientific frameworks. We're going to think about first information deficiencies. So trying to understand that for some component of people who are hesitant to vaccinate, there might really just be informational challenges and they can't really decide what's the best thing due to their kind of lack of access to like good health information. We're also going to think about collective action, right, which is something that comes up a lot in the social sciences. And this is this idea that we need to be able to get a lot of people to pursue a shared goal, even if the individual incentives are going to be a little bit different from shared incentives, which I'm going to get into a little bit more in the next slide. And third, we're looking really directly at this question of politicization of vaccines. And so thinking about how kind of varying political messaging, either by tapping into like alternative sources of authority or using different groups to administer vaccines, can help start to address some of this hesitancy. So just to go a little bit deeper on collective action, because I know that this is kind of a mixed audience and I want to make sure that everything that we do makes sense. There are kind of three things from the collective action framework that we thought might be very relevant to vaccination. So the first of that is this concern about free riding. And so that's the idea that if everybody else is getting vaccinated, then I'm less likely to get COVID because they're less likely to give it to me. And that could dampen individual incentives to vaccinate when you have a high level of vaccination. And so the expectation there would be that as community uptake increases, the hesitant will feel even less inclined to get vaccinated, right? Because, well, if I'm not going to get it, I might as well not take on this risk of getting vaccinated from their perspective. A second thought from this collective action framework might be this kind of opposed idea of coordination. And that would be that the collective benefits to vaccination really are only achieved at high numbers. So if I'm kind of not sure about the vaccine and I don't think we're going to get to herd immunity anyways, I might as well not take it. Versus if I think that maybe we could get to herd immunity, I might have an increased incentive to take the vaccine because then I'm going to have a greater benefit when we get all these, economic benefits, the lift of lockdown orders, those sorts of things. And then third, we're going to draw on this idea of selective incentives that are often used to address collective action problems. And this is the idea that for people who do not perceive the vaccine to be directly like a benefit to them, like such as the hesitant, that there might be other benefits that we could tie to vaccination that would increase their willingness to chip into this collective good. So those are the kind of three types of collective action we're going to think about over the course of this, in addition to other informational and political messaging. So we did a survey across 6 Latin American countries to test the effects of these types of messages to encourage vaccine uptake among the vaccine hesitant. So in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. And we conducted the survey in January of 2021. So throughout this talk, there will be parts that I think probably are more and less relevant because of how things have changed since then. But this is the data that we're working with for these findings. And we drew a survey population that were nationally representative by age, gender, socioeconomic status, and region in each country to kind of start getting also at some of these really important subnational and identity-based differences that we've been talking about throughout this panel. To give a little bit of insight into the design of the survey, we were aiming only to look at these messaging interventions for people who did report vaccine hesitancy. So we initially gathered a sample of about 13,000 respondents, and we screened out 5,000 who said that, you know what, even like, no matter what, I'm willing to take a vaccine and I'll do it within 2 months. For people who wanted to wait longer than 2 months or who reported that they were not willing to take a vaccine, we categorized them as hesitant. And we thought that this time lag was important for these reasons that we've talked about, right? With the emergence of variants and with this kind of concern that at some point our vaccines might be obsolete if we can't get everyone to take these soon enough altogether. So then we moved into 3 different experimental modules and that each respondent moved through. So the first, we looked at information treatments, and these were just basic information about the safety and efficacy of the vaccine, and then some additional information about, in this first box, whether Biden had taken the vaccine, which we thought was kind of just like a person that wouldn't take it if it wasn't safe, to kind of increase the credibility of the safety message. Then we have a treatment that gives the safety and efficacy information in addition to information about the level of vaccination needed for herd immunity, which was either 60, 70, or 80%, which were all kind of different expert recommendations at different times leading up to when we fielded the survey. And then we had another informational condition that talked about the safety and efficacy information that gave the herd immunity threshold, and then also gave the current level of willingness in people's countries so that they had a point of reference for where herd immunity is relative to where we are right now in terms of willingness to take the vaccine. Then we moved into motivation treatments, which I'll talk about a little bit later when we go through those results. And then we moved into the mass vaccine scenarios, which we used in order to test these kind of more political dimensions of the question. Throughout this survey, we're measuring vaccine intentions in 3 ways. So our first is a 5-point scale, which measures the agreement and disagreement with the statement, if a vaccine were available to me right now, I would get vaccinated. And this is going to range from strongly disagree to strongly agree in like a 5-point spread. We're going to have a measure for the speed of intended vaccine uptake, which is how long a person would wait to get vaccinated if a vaccine was available to them now. And then we're also looking at the likelihood of encouraging others, which isn't a main outcome for us, but we think is also kind of interesting in terms of what are the secondary effects of messaging within like community and within social relationships. And just from our pre-treatment screening, we were able also to obtain estimates of national levels of vaccine acceptance and vaccine hesitancy. And as you can see here, Brazil, among the countries that we surveyed, was a very vaccine acceptant country for the most part, which is great. And then overall, we had about 59% willingness to vaccinate by the criteria that we had defined, and an average wait of around 4 months, 4.5 months. So those are kind of the descriptive findings from the beginning of our survey. To get into the information section of the design, we provided people with basic information, as I said, about the health benefits of the vaccine so that they were safe, that they had rigorous medical trials, that there were only very minor side effects, and that you couldn't contract COVID-19 from a vaccine, which we felt like were kind of the 4 biggest concerns about safety. And then we conducted an internalization test, which is essentially just where the respondent reiterates back to you what you just told them to make sure that they were kind of understanding or reading the information we were providing. And then, as I talked about before, we added these 3 additional features to different components of the information treatment. So whether Biden took the vaccine, what the herd immunity threshold was, and then how herd immunity compared to current vaccine acceptance. And overall, our results I actually felt were very positive in this section. We found that basic health information increased vaccine willingness by about 5 percentage points, or increased 15% of our hesitant sample to be willing to vaccinate, which we felt like was a relatively strong result. As you can see here, Brazil was a country in which that held up for, like in our Brazilian sample, people responded well to just this basic health and efficacy information, not enough to completely close the vaccination gap, but more than we might think about given how politicized this issue area has become. We found really limited evidence for our kind of more collective action lenses. So we didn't find evidence of free riding, social learning, or the Biden endorsement as being like particularly different from just the basic health information, which in a way is a very actionable message for public health campaigns, right? That even just starting with the strong diffusion of safety and efficacy information can start to yield gains among the hesitant. We did find that people responded well to expecting to be part of a successful effort to achieve herd immunity. So, and this was basically what we found was that if it looked like, based on the current willingness levels, that herd immunity would be achieved, people were much more likely to, after the information treatment, report that they were willing to get vaccinated. And so I think this is also actionable, right? Where it's like, in places with high levels of vaccination, public messaging could emphasize that, hey, look, this is actually going really well. And maybe that'll help bring people along, which I think is a little bit in contrast to how the media tends to focus on how it's going really badly. So that was another result that we felt like could be important. So to get now into the motivation side of our design, this was the second module of our survey experiment. And here we had 3 different conditions in addition to a pure control to try to understand how more motivational messaging might shape people's vaccination decisions. So here we are looking at an altruism condition, an economic recovery condition, and a social approval condition, in which altruism emphasized that you could protect the vulnerable by getting vaccinated, in which economic recovery emphasized that getting vaccinated would help return to normal economic conditions and help the economy recover, and in which social approval emphasized that you would get respect from your community for vaccinating. And we found that the altruism and economic recovery prompts were almost indistinguishable from the control group, that people were really not very responsive across the board to those messages. But in each of our countries that we conducted the survey, there was a strong response to the social approval prompt, which increased willingness at kind of a similar magnitude to the basic health information. So that was another recommendation that we took away for policymakers, that even for people who might not think that there's health benefits to vaccination, if they think that they'll gain respect in their community or obtain social privilege through vaccination, that's another potentially motivating area for people. So finally, the last experimental module, and then I'll just quickly wrap up, was looking more at the political dimensions of how vaccines might plausibly be distributed. And for this, what we wanted to see was how variation, as we talked about in this panel prior, in the producer country, in the efficacy, in the person that's endorsing the vaccine publicly, in the distributor of the vaccine, so where you go to get your shot, and in the community take-up rate might be shaping people's vaccine decisions. So across these different dimensions, we're going to present people with text that vary which producer they're getting, whether that's Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Gamaleya, Sinovac, or an unspecified vaccine. Whether or not they're getting correct phase 3 trial efficacy information, we didn't want to mislead people, so it's either you get the efficacy that goes to that vaccine, or you just don't get that information in this scenario. The endorser, so here we have somebody who's like an authority figure, whether that's the president, the mayor, a national medical association, a religious leader of your denomination. So if you're Catholic or evangelical, we found the right person for you. A left-leaning newspaper and a right-leaning newspaper as potential endorsers. We had 3 different distributors: healthcare system, military, civil society, and then finally we varied the community take-up rate from unspecified or between 1 and 75% at these intervals. And I know that's a lot of information, so I don't think it's essential to remember all of it, but we'll go a little bit more descriptively through the results. And so this was just the sample text that we showed them. And again, we're just putting in variations of this configuration of traits to different scenarios, which is going to let us estimate the marginal impact of changing between these different components of each category for people's willingness to vaccinate. So these are the results on the left for willingness to take the vaccine, and on the right for how long people would wait. And I think there's kind of 2 really important takeaways from just the overall results. The first is that the medical professionals, whether that was the distributor as the National Health System or the endorser as the National Medical Association, were really the most effective. As we can see up here and through here, the alternative distributors as well as the alternative endorsers all did worse than just medical professionals in terms of encouraging people to want to vaccinate in these different scenarios. So that was the first takeaway, that medical professionals probably are the way to go to the extent that there's control over this. The second takeaway really speaks to this conversation we were having earlier about how people are thinking about vaccine hesitancy as responsive to specific vaccines relative to perhaps vaccine hesitancy just in general, right? And so what we do find is there is greater acceptance for the AstraZeneca and the Pfizer vaccine relative to the Sinovac and the Gamaleya. I would be curious if we redid this now, if people would be more acceptant of the Gamaleya vaccine, because I think that's moved a lot in the last few months. And we do also see that people are responding very well to this high efficacy information, right? So that's the 95 for Pfizer and the 91 for Gamaleya. That really moves people in the direction of wanting to vaccinate in our data. We looked at a lot of heterogeneous effects of this, which I'd be happy to discuss later, but the probably strongest result that we got was looking at trust in these different distributors, providers, and endorsers in terms of shaping people's responsiveness to those particular messages. And so what we found was for both country of provision for the vaccine or country of producing the vaccine, as well as for the entity endorsing the vaccine, people were much more responsive to countries' vaccines and leaders that they trusted. And so this like holds for religious leaders, for mayors, for presidents, and for left and right newspapers. If I trust a source prior to knowing that they're endorsing a vaccine, I'm much more likely to take their recommendation when they recommend a vaccine. And what was interesting was this was particularly strong also among kind of more overall more hesitant groups and groups that we think about potentially having a harder time reaching, like evangelical Christians. They were very responsive to evangelical endorsements of the vaccine. And I think this is like a good way for also to think about maybe having like some national vaccine messaging and then also really encouraging local authorities to encourage people that trust them to obtain vaccination, which I know not everyone will be willing to do that, but I think there is the potential there to be motivating to people. So just to quickly sum up and conclude, our key findings were that hesitancy is a social and a political problem, as we've all been talking about throughout this panel. That information really does matter, and remedying basic informational deficiencies can help move the segment of the hesitant population who's just not sure and doesn't understand really whether it's safe or not. That can be motivating to them to pursue vaccination. And that medical distributors and endorsers are really the most effective at boosting efficacy. Although, as we were talking about, trust in producers and endorsers can also help move people when they're getting this information from sources that they trust. Our study definitely has some limitations, probably the most important of which is that we can't observe, or we couldn't at the time, observe immediate behaviors, right? Because vaccines were not accessible for the vast majority of our respondents in January when we fielded this survey. We didn't vary the intensity of messages or have competing messages, which I think is such a strong trait of the vaccine information environment right now, which we're going to definitely need to figure out how to help people navigate. And that I think as vaccines have become available, people's beliefs are likely to have changed as they've seen people in their communities vaccinate safely. So those are some ways that I think probably there's a little bit of nuance needed to these findings. Overall, I would expect acceptance to be improving due to these reasons. I want to draw out just 3 quick policy implications. The first, as we talked about, is just this importance of basic health information, which we found to be a very actionable, clear policy implication with a focus on safety and efficacy and using respected medical professionals as messengers. Another policy implication we thought was very clear was that governments should harness low-cost ways of making vaccination behavior visible to others to improve this kind of social the social approval mechanism for the motivation. And that can be as simple as these I got vaccinated stickers, or when you have a hashtag on Twitter or something to post your selfie. I think that kind of thing would be a very not every government can sponsor a lottery, right? So it would be a very affordable way to start getting people motivated for other reasons. And then finally, I think our third policy implication was that there should be an effort to really emphasize the success of vaccination. So when it's high, say that it's high. Don't relentlessly focus on the last 20% that haven't done it yet, because people might be more willing to get vaccinated if they think that it'll mean putting COVID completely behind us. So those are our policy implications, and I really look forward to further discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elena. And I wanted to provide a few comments and then we can have a discussion. And the first thing that comes to mind is that certainly vaccine hesitancy is not a static concept. It evolves, and definitely there are different factors that can affect vaccine hesitancy. So I think that the first thing that we can learn is that people who are vaccine hesitant do not always remain hesitant. And I wanted to give a couple comments about the places that are close to me, which is, well, right now, I usually live in New Orleans, in Louisiana. And in Louisiana, it has one of the lowest vaccination rates in the United States. It's about a third of the population has been fully vaccinated. Luckily, in New Orleans, it's 2/3. So there's been right now, New Orleans is experiencing, well, the state of Louisiana is experiencing the third worst number of cases since the beginning of the pandemic, despite vaccination. And I was reading reports this morning that in some people are starting to become concerned, people who have not been vaccinated. And there's a very right-wing congressman and that represents Louisiana in the US Congress who got his first shot this week out of concern about the spread of the Delta variant. And hopefully that can also convince other people to do the same. But they were saying that there are some people are starting to accept to get vaccinated for fear of what they're seeing around them, and then the fact that younger and younger people are being intubated in hospitals. But hopefully it's not just fear what would make, there are many reasons to get vaccinated, and it would definitely be better if it were not just fear. But that's what it is. And one of the things is that in one of the slides that Ray presented earlier, I saw that Spain, which is where I am right now, and where I'm from originally, that Spain had a very high hesitancy. It was in one of the slides. It was like at the top of the list. And on the other hand, Spain is the country in the world, according to some surveys, that has the highest coverage of vaccine, of full vaccination. Here we are more than 50%, despite the fact that earlier in this year, the vaccination, it was very slow. And, it took even people who are in their 80s several months to get vaccinated. And now here in Spain, we are at the very top of vaccination rates. So I wonder, what happened in Spain? There was hesitancy, and then now, however, there are vaccines available, and a lot of people want to get vaccinated. So that's wonderful. And so that was one comment I had. I also wanted to stress the fact that the different types of vaccines, because for a long time, I'm a medical anthropologist. I'm also a public health person. And from the public health perspective, we were told, and I would also tell people, the best vaccine is the first vaccine that you can have. But then we started to have all these different types of vaccines with very different efficacy. And as you know, Sinovac, it's about 51%, has a 51%, it's just right above the WHO threshold. So if I'm given the choice, I'm being fully vaccinated for months, but if I were given the choice, I would certainly choose a vaccine that has a high efficacy. And there are countries where it depends on what day for example, in Louisiana, you can choose what type of vaccine you want. There are all different, not all the vaccines are available in the United States, but there's several vaccines that you can choose from. And there are other countries where that's not the case. And there are, I think Lorena was saying that in Brazil, there are about 4 or 5 different types of vaccines, but they haven't always all been available at the same time. So sometimes it's just the one that is available, the best one for people. But I think that what the results showed, I think those were from Elena's results, is that there's a different acceptance of the vaccine depending on the types of vaccines. And I see that as a good outcome because it is, I think it means that people are actually doing some information gathering before they make their decision. And I think that is a positive outcome, because we often in the US polarize, you see, there's these great trends. In the state of Louisiana, for example, it's very clear that vaccine hesitancy is along party lines. And the fact that there are people who are considering choosing one vaccine over another, or at least more open to get vaccinated if they have a high efficacy vaccine, I think it's a good result. It means that people are not just accepting political information that is biased, but they are doing some reading. Well, I mean, those are some of my thoughts based on the three presentations. And of course, it's interesting that the three of you, although you use different surveys and different sources of information, the three of you could actually, get together and write a paper, and it wouldn't. Yeah. I think it would be easy to agree, to agree on your perspectives and findings. So I'd like to open the discussion, talking first about these changes that have happened in certain populations about becoming more open to getting vaccinated, and then also about the way that people are considering the types of vaccine efficacy, making their choices.
Just a little remind everybody that we are getting email questions through earresponde@usp.br. Okay. I don't know how to say that in English. You spell that, Lorena, right? earresponde@usp.br. Most of the questions really want you to share the slides if it's possible, and the references for both of your work, so all of your work, right? Especially Oxford work. So, sorry to interrupt, Padachu. Go ahead.
No problem. So,
I was going to ask a question about Spain, which I think is a really interesting observation. And I actually spent a lot of my time in France, where the phenomenon even is more exaggerated. So in our survey, France was the most hesitant country. I mean, off the chart. But if you look at France today, it has very high, in the European context, has very high vaccination rates. And so public opinion really flipped. And I think to some extent we see that in Spain also. And I think part of the explanation is Elena's work, which basically, I think what you saw in France is a public sort of recognition that it was a socially good thing to do, that there was an effort by all of the sort of trusted medical professionals to sort of make it clear that this was the thing, was critically important. All of the political elites were sort of very consistent on this, signaling that vaccines were important. And as a result, you saw this, I mean, it really is dramatic, the flip, right? From being extremely vaccine hesitant to being pretty vaccine acceptant. The other part of it has to do with branding. And I think branding did play an important part in it, because one of the reasons that there was a very slow start in France was because of AstraZeneca. People did not want to take it. I mean, once there was clear signals that there were some issues associated with AstraZeneca, the French basically became extremely reluctant. And the government responded by basically saying, okay, we'll just buy Pfizer and Moderna. And that was critical in sort of turning over the vaccine sort of enthusiasm of the public. So, I mean, I think there's elements of Elena and Lorena in this sort of really interesting French story.
Okay, I'm here. So I want to say a couple of things. First, I think it isn't static, and I think that that's incredibly important to understand and to study these trends across time. But I think that what's important also is to situate ourselves, because where we are in July 2021 is not where we were in January 2020. And where we are in July 2021 is not also where we're going to be in 2022.
Yes.
And we have to think about realistically some of the issues. So one issue, just to be a little bit, to raise a little bit of debate, right? One thing I think that's important is there's been a lot of controversy around the Sinovac and the Sinopharm vaccines, for example. But we've always tried to stress there's a difference in the efficacy rates are not translatable across vaccine studies.
Yes.
So when we study the Sinovac study and we say 51%, it's very important to stress that that vaccine was tested in medical personnel in Brazil during the peak of the pandemic. Exposure in that group, and what the studies show is, yes, in that it's a very hard test for a vaccine, but it's very different from the Pfizer tests and the other phase 3 studies, which were done in the general population. So, and there's very different sets of tests or strategies we can have around vaccines. But the idea of the Sinovac test is important to understand, because the 51% is not in the general population. And when we have effectiveness studies like we have in Uruguay and like we have in Chile,
or even in Brazil in 2 cities, right?
We have in Brazil, and we have in Manaus, and we have in Sao Paulo. The effectiveness studies are showing that the vaccine is very, very competitive and very comparable. There is a slightly smaller difference as compared to the Pfizer, but it depends on the age group. Actually, the vaccine is safer, has less adverse events. For certain groups of individuals, if we look at and stratify, there's cost-benefit scenarios where it's actually not as ineffective as it's being transmitted in the media. And so I think that that's important to stress. The vaccines are not developed to make you invincible. What we're worried about and what we want to know is that they protect you against serious disease and death. And even CoronaVac, there is strong evidence that's been released in those 3 countries that we have data now to show that it is working. I think that's important to stress, because we have to also think about the future in terms of thinking about and putting perspective in from a perspective of development. We're at the moment right now where it is very expensive for all of the world to depend on purchasing only Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, and for us to having a yearly budget allocated to booster shots of Pfizer and Moderna vaccines as our only strategy for getting ourselves out of the pandemic. And so we have to think about also thinking about the sustainability of strategies, and thinking about that the vaccine is one part of a big complex portfolio of response. If we're not testing, if we're not increasing social distancing, if we're not doing the other things, then the vaccines don't work as well. And we have data on that in Chile, we have that data on that in Uruguay, we have data that on Brazil, we have data on that in Europe and in the US. So the vaccine is part of the solution, but the other part of the package, we have to admit also that it contributed to the effectiveness studies that we're reading. So the effectiveness studies are saying, how does this work in the real world with all of the issues that we're seeing on the ground that are so difficult about fighting this pandemic? Vulnerability of different social groups. And I think we have to go back a little bit to the issue of the right. Because I think that it is important to understand that this has been politicized and will continue to, politics will continue to play a role. But I think that there's a political discussion to discuss, like we did when we had HIV/AIDS, where we discuss antiretrovirals and generic treatment. And it took us decades to get to that discussion. And so I think we're at a moment where we have to think about, to save and guarantee vaccine coverage for the entire globe, is it going to be a strategy? How are we going to get there? Is it going to be by sharing technology, transferring technology, generating local manufacturing capabilities, and maybe with vaccines that are not Pfizer and not Moderna, because maybe those patents won't be transferred to developing countries. But it doesn't mean that we can't protect society and we can't prevent death and illness, like we do with flu, like we do with most of the vaccines that we import from India and China today, and not from Pfizer. And we're still saving lives with those vaccines. So I have a kind of a view that trying to kind of think about the nuances of this. But I think Arachu's right. People are going to read and consume information and make decisions. But I think we need to have a fair debate about what the trade-offs are and the risks, and also being more conscientious of thinking about how difficult the decision is right now, because there isn't enough Pfizer and Moderna vaccines for the whole world to vaccinate through those strategies.
Yeah, I'd love to weigh in on this last point. And I thought the data presented from the Oxford team was so striking for this reason about support for vaccine redistribution. We have kind of another ongoing project right now with the same group that's looking at vaccine diplomacy and whether trust in foreign countries increases based on receiving a vaccine produced abroad. And what we're finding there is that really only China gets reputational benefits. But I think, which is from one level, discouraging a little bit for the incentives of the US or the UK or other kind of advanced industrialized countries to continue trying to provide vaccines. But I think that there's data on kind of domestic political reasons to provide vaccines to other countries, if you're going to get support domestically, politically, could be very motivating to politicians. And so I think that's a really important finding to bring to this debate. And I would hope that it becomes a little bit more diffused and that people are aware of that, perspective as well.
I just wanted to I just remembered one thing really quickly. I saw a slide from a US physician that was talking about US hesitancy, and he opened the refrigerator and he said, look at all of the vaccines that I have in my office, and you don't even know the brand, and you come in here and you take these every day. And all of a sudden during COVID, that changed, right? And we completely have changed it into a kind of a shopping of you get to pick your vaccine. That's very different from how we did vaccines before COVID in general. And I think that that's something we need to spend some time debating. Where are we going with that model?
And if I may, I think ideology has a lot to do with that. And the way that the pandemic was framed by being Chinese, by even masks, we were discussing in the last session, even masks were there was a dispute in the peripheries of Brazil if masks were coming from China, what would that be? So I think infodemia is a real big problem, and this is a political problem in my opinion. And I have a question for you in that direction, is that how human rights and the use of human rights-based perspectives are important or not. I don't know if you are familiar with the human rights-based perspective and the notion that the difficulty of discussing my own individual liberty should not be, how can I say, violated by forcing me to get vaccinated, and how, what is the dilemma about the human rights-based perspective use, which is reciprocity is a principle of human rights-based perspectives of health, and how can we frame it in a better way as we have been done with HIV/AIDS and many other approaches to public health. So just curious of your opinion on that, or your take on that.
Well, I might chime in on I think the human rights issue is really extremely interesting because, and it has, I mean, again, I hate to revert back to France, but it's sort of, it is a very big issue in France because, of course, the government is moving towards mandating vaccines for everybody. I mean, they've just implemented laws that mandated for healthcare providers, but the notion is that this is going to go much further, and it's raised both on the left and on the right real concerns. I mean, the left is not comfortable with this notion that the government is going to sort of impose this requirement on individuals, as are the right is exactly opposed, and the libertarian sort of center right are also opposed. So it's a real interesting political conversation that I think is going to have to happen. And it's going to be different in different countries because it will never happen in the United States. I mean, there will not be. I mean, it's almost unfathomable that there will be a government-mandated adult vaccination. I would be extremely surprised. So, and politics again enters there. I mean, it's really a very delicate political issue. So yes, I think it's a sensitive issue that I'm not sure what direction we're going to go in on this.
Yeah, I'd be happy to also weigh in on this. I think one other important thing to highlight is how kind of historical human rights issues also factor into some of these contemporary drivers of hesitancy. And I think we've seen that really clearly in the US context, where groups that have been kind of historically mistreated by the state are now very resistant, right, to entering into vaccination campaigns due to kind of like lingering trust from these abuses. And I think it's important to think about these vaccine mandates in part of like a historical precedent setting way as well, right? Of like, do we want to also kind of potentially negatively influence future public health endeavors by mandating vaccination among groups we've already alienated, right? Or are there better ways to kind of bring people into the fold? And so I think like there's a short-term calculation that needs to be made about like loss of life in the immediate term. And then there's also like public policymakers should really be aware of the long-term consequences of these choices.
The one other thing I just want to, this is to follow with a number of the comments that have been made, and it's people haven't sort of, well, Lorena has mentioned it, but I mean, I think the social media is the critical element here, right? So yes, I think, Loretta, you're right. So, why, this doctor opens up this refrigerator and there's a gazillion different vaccines in there and he's saying, you never ask about them. But that's because historically we didn't have social media. But now, we have social media, and I suspect this is going to happen perennially now in the future, right? People will have people will not simply say, oh, I don't care what the brand is, I'll take it. I think people are going to be extremely more engaged about these kinds of decisions, and it's something we've never had to deal with before. So it's and I'm not sure how we will, but I think the social media stuff that you sort of pointed out is the critical variable here.
Yes, I think so. The social media, the issue is also the regulation of this, right? So what we've seen a lot during the pandemic is at the beginning, for example, President Bolsonaro's, the videos, the tweets, everything has been allowed to circulate. There's a tweet, for example, of a congressman who stated that the coronavac vaccine is equivalent to the morning after pill. And it's allowed to, the tweet has never been removed from Twitter. So I think the hard thing is what we have to debate a little bit is disinformation. It's very, on the one hand, I love Twitter when a new study comes out, a new phase 3 study comes out, and there's a lot of interaction in Twitter to discuss the phase 3, discuss how to interpret or discuss an effectiveness study. And there's a lot of debates on Twitter that are really helpful and insightful. But we have to remember that the majority of the population that is on these platforms is not going only for to seek information, but is also going to kind of cheer and validate certain beliefs and certain ideas they have. And I think the hard thing is social media is both. It is a platform for having debates and discussion, and it is also a place where we politicize and we root for who we support. And that's they're two very different missions, right? And on top of that, we have a lot of difficulty, I think, because there's so many different languages that a lot of the monitoring and what is happening on social media increasingly becomes complex, because even through like artificial intelligence or different types of technologies that we could detect fake news about vaccines on these platforms, it's very difficult to do because you have to do it across multiple languages.
Okay, I saw Aratu is back. Hello, Aratu?
I think Aratu is frozen.
It's just frozen again. Yeah, we lost her.
Hello. Yes, my internet.
Okay. Aratu, thank you for your effort. I think I'm taking...
Hello?
Hello? Hello? Okay, I'm doing it. So thank you again. Aratu, I don't know if you hear us or not.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, now, yes. But we need to end because of the translators.
Okay.
And then I really want to thank you all, first of all, of taking on a short notice in your vacations mostly We are all on vacations, in fact, but this is how we do in COVID times, right? And again, to thank Harvard School of Public Health and David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Study, who is providing for this translation and the support. I thank you a lot for the contributions. And I must say, we are going to have a third one and a fourth one, probably a third one in October. And these kind of issues will come back, mostly, for example, the discussion on human rights. Sophia Gresking would be one of the speakers in the next in the third webinar, right, where we are bringing more the individual approach, like communication, something that we already had a beautiful conversation today, right? We and the others is very curious about the methodology you do your experiments, and we heard a lot of questions on what were your methods for doing your experiments were. Please, if you can share with us by email your publications and your PowerPoints. So there's a lot of people doing research on that, and we will come back to these kinds of issues on more individual, more communication issues and more community. How do we do community involvement? And your presentations were wonderful to feed us to our thinking here, right? So I thank you all. Thank you, Arachu, for being here. It's lovely to see you again, right? Many people who are on COVID now were at AIDS, so we know each other for some time, right? And I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, some of you, at night, some of us, and rest. So we have another session, the last session. It's on Latin America, beginning at 2:00, beginning with PAHO director, Dr. Jabas, who is going to speak. Coordinated and mediated by Mario Peceni, with our dear colleague from Argentina, from UBA and CONICET, and the second session on Latin American and COVID response with the CEPAL ECLAC contribution and many other researchers that were, again, we were so pleased that they accepted our invitation in a short notice. So thank you a lot. I hope to see you again and for your effort, and see you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arachu. It was wonderful, wonderful.